Hi folks, this is all the fruit. I'm in the town of Menton on the Côte d'Azur on the French Mediterranean coast. And here is a big department park, like what would correspond to a county park in the US. This park is right next to the famous botanic garden of Valramé. But in contrast to the botanic garden, this park is dedicated only to one single species of tree, to the olive tree. Well, the olive tree, basically the culture of the olive tree defines where you have Mediterranean climate and where you don't. You go too far north, it gets too cold. You go too far east, it gets too cold and often also too dry. You go too far south into the Sahara, it gets too dry. You go too far west and northwest, it gets too wet for the olives. So, hot, dry summers and kind of mild winters. That's the Mediterranean climate, and that's the area where you can grow olive trees. And here in Menton, we are in the city or town with the mildest climate in all of continental France. There are some articles which claim that there has not been any frost here in all of the 20th century. Well, olives can stand up to minus 17 degrees of frost. And in big parts of northern Italy, in Tuscany and also in Liguria, which is basically the coast of the same Gulf, which also, like the eastern part of this big Gulf of Genoa is like the Italian Riviera. The western part is the French Côte d'Azur. And on the Italian Riviera, those ancient olives froze back towards the end of the 20th century, and now you just have little suckers coming out of the old roots. Here, those olives, they did not freeze back in the 20th century because, as I already mentioned, there was no frost here in the 20th century. So how old are those olives? The problem is old olive trees are hollow. In this park, right next to the famous botanic garden of Valramé, there are maybe between 500 and 1,000 ancient olive trees, and I haven't seen a single young one. But all those ancient olive trees are more or less hollow. So it's kind of impossible to tell how old they really are. Here, one of the younger stems, it's just a little bit hollow. But look at this old tree here. You can basically fit a couple people in this hole, in the trunk. The wood is rock hard. They make really beautiful kitchen appliances from it because it doesn't rot. Such ancient olive groves are quite typical for southern Italy, like for the area of Puglia, southeastern Italy. I've seen very few tiny ancient olive groves in Malta and southern Spain. And here in France, so far north, it's even more amazing. With this olive tree, you can only guess the age. It's pretty sure that it was around in the Middle Ages, so it's the time of the Byzantine Empire and of Charlemagne. I don't know if it was already around at the time of the unified Roman Empire, if it's the time of Julius Caesar or Jesus Christ. It's very well possible. Olives have been introduced here by the Greeks even before Roman times. And some people claim that some of the ancient olive groves, that those trees were planted by the Romans or the Greeks. But those olive groves are usually in the south, in southern Italy, southern Greece. Not that far north. Not basically in the foothills of the Alps. Yeah, if I continue climbing this slope, I will end up in the Alps. So look at this. This tree here is over 2 meters thick. when you know how slow olive trees grow, you can very well imagine that this tree was around in the time of Jesus Christ. Some people say an olive tree can grow 2 meters thick in 1,000 years. Some say, well, maybe you would need like 2,000 years for that. Olive trees that size are pretty rare, even in Puglia and even in southern areas of Greece. I think the thickest olive tree I've ever seen was a tree in Puglia, which was maybe 40 to 50% thicker than this. This one is probably 2 meters to 2 meters 40, the thickest tree I saw in Puglia, and this was one single specimen among hundreds of thousands of olives, was maybe a little bit over 3 meters thick. In Puglia there are like, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of such ancient olive trees from the Mediterranean, from the medieval times or even older. And I managed to find 1 or 2 trees which are more thick than those here, but here we are almost 1,000 kilometers further north. Here we are in an area which shouldn't be able to support such giant olives. Just let me grab my bag and then I'll show you another tree. Basically, you can spend hours walking around here, measuring the olive trees, making pictures in front of the olive trees, comparing your size to those giant ancient trees. And just remember that even hundreds of kilometers further south than here, basically all the olive trees froze sometimes several times during the last century. That such giant trees like here, I don't think there is any area north of Puglia where you can expect huge numbers of such enormous olive trees. Look at this one over there. I mean, this has fallen apart, but you can still see that it was once one single trunk. And this trunk, I mean, the distance between those 2 trees is quite large. So if this was one single tree, of which I'm sure, look, it is actually one single tree. Here you can see they are connected. If this was one single tree, then the trunk is almost 3 meters thick, almost as thick as the oldest and thickest olive trees I've seen in southern Italy. But here we are so far north. We are on the southern slopes of the Alps where they meet the Mediterranean Sea. And we have such giant trees. A lot of those trees are far over 1 meter thick, and single ones are over 2 meters. And this thing here, which has fallen apart, is basically almost 3 meters thick. So folks, if you come to Menton and if you visit the famous botanic garden of Valrame, don't think that the park next to the botanic garden is boring because it has like 1,000 specimens of one single tree. Those trees here, better than anything else, better than any graphs, better than any numbers, better than any explanations, show you how mild the climate in this area is. If an olive tree can survive here in France on the southern slopes of the Alps for 1,000 or 2,000 years even, without its trunk freezing back to the ground, or basically even also without its roots freezing, then despite being very far north here, we are further north than New York here. We are basically, here we are basically at the latitude of Canada, of southern Canada. And we've had olive trees which didn't freeze back for 1,000 to 2,000 years. I think despite having one single species of tree in this park, this is incredibly impressive, and I don't regret making such a long video about the park with just one single species. Well, I didn't even try the fruit, the green olives. Well, In that state, you can basically pickle them in salt water or in oil. When they're fresh, they're just bitter and disgusting. So fruit tasting is basically not the main purpose of this video, but I just had to make it to show you those impressive trees that far north. If anybody would have told me that such a thing exists in southern France, I would have told them, bah, I know they cultivate olives on a small scale in southern France, but they freeze back every 20 or 30 years. But not those here. So folks, if you manage to visit Menton, the city with the mildest climate in southern France, don't just go to all the diverse botanic gardens, but also visit this big park right next to the most interesting botanic garden and say hello to the ancient olive trees from me. Well, stay tuned for a lot more fruit videos from beautiful Menton, and don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe.